Welcome. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. That's one of the profound and enigmatic statements by the person we are looking at today, because it's time for us to look at another. And for today, I have a wonderful treat for you in store. I'll tell you in a minute what it is. But before I do, just a reminder that this is not an academic lecture, nor is it a university. So we are approaching, when we look at a book, we're approaching it in a different way, not analytically or historically, but attempting to go to the very essence of whatever teaching the book contains. Now, to go to the very essence of a teaching, a spiritual teaching, it's always that, you have to go to the very essence of who you are. The teaching is there, no matter whether it's a contemporary spiritual teaching or whether it's 2,000 years old or older. The spiritual teaching is never about anything that's not you. It's always about you. So when we look at a book, as we do from time to time here and again today, we're not really examining a book. We're looking at you, or rather you are looking at yourself through the medium of a particular spiritual teaching. So we are not studying anything outside of you. That would be pointless. Could be entertaining, but so you can always go to university to do that. There's a place for that too. But here we are concerned with something more vital. And that is the essence of who you are. So that you can realize that essence and begin to live from and through that essence that is beyond the personality. So for our book today, first let me say, today it's not really a book as such, although it comes of course in the form of a book. It's a teaching, and there are various books that contain parts of that teaching. For today we travel back in time about 700 years to the Middle Ages in Europe. That's on the surface. In essence, of course, it's always now, as you'll see. We go back 700 years in time, and we are going to look at the teachings of my namesake, Meister Eckhart, who was born around 1260 in Germany and was, of course, a monk the only people at the time who could read and write. And he was a monk in the Dominican order, became an important figure in the Dominican order, a well-known, famous teacher, taught in Paris and other places. And Meister Eckhart was forgotten for a few hundred years and then rediscovered about the 19th century or so. He's sometimes called a philosopher, but he's not really a philosopher. He's a mystic, yes, and basically a spiritual teacher, one of the most profound, powerful spiritual teachers ever. He taught, of course, within the confines of the church at that time. So there was always, looking over his shoulder, so to speak, the thought police of the institution of the church, because one wrong thought expressed in public could easily lead to your death, and not a very pleasant death. So he taught within the confines of that, and it's a miracle, and it's how he was able to give birth to a powerful, vitally alive spiritual teaching within the confines of the terminology that he had to use. Towards the end of his life, more and more critical voices came, and he was finally condemned. His teaching was condemned by the church authorities, the Pope, the Vatican, and luckily, just before the news reached him that his teachings had been condemned, he passed away. One interesting fact about his teachings is that the most powerful teachings of his, which are called the German sermons, were delivered mostly to women, to audiences of nuns, because he was responsible, it was one of his jobs, to be a spiritual advisor of convents. So he would go into convents and deliver his powerful, profound teachings in the German language. That was also revolutionary, because up till then, virtually all teachings of that kind were given in Latin. So he was one of the first to use the vernacular in any country. And those are the most powerful teachings. The way he uses language is absolutely unique. He sometimes creates his own words. Now we, of course, are going to look at his teaching in translation into English. It is certainly more powerful in the original, as is usually the case when you translate an inspired text. It suffers a little in the translation, but that's fine. In any case, even if you could read and speak German fluently, you would still not be reading the original, because the original language in which he spoke is the old form of German, which would be very hard, even if you knew modern German, for you to decipher. It's called Middle High German. So even a German reader would need to read the translation. It's more distant from modern German than Chaucer is in English, is to modern English. I believe the fact that he was teaching women was a very important factor in what came through him. If you look at some of his Latin sermons, which are mostly given in more conventional academic settings, they are not as powerful, they are more conventional and drier than the German sermons. So he found in the female audience, I would say, a much greater receptivity for his teachings. And probably his teachings would not be in existence if he had not had that receptive female audience. Because, as the ancient saying goes, the teacher and the taught together produce the teaching. So let's look at some of his teachings. It's not a systematic philosophy. We can take almost any fragment of Meister Eckhart. Meister, by the way, means master. That was his academic title. Nobody knows for sure whether Eckhart was his first name or his last name. We can take almost any fragment out of the teaching, look at it, and see that in many cases, almost any fragment, already contains the whole. That's the beauty of the great spiritual teachings. So let's look at the little fragment I started with, and I'll read to you. Oh, by the way, I will occasionally refer to this book of Meister Eckhart. It's a Penguin classic. Selected talks, sermons by Meister Eckhart, selected writings. There are other books that contain other selections by him. I've also scribbled down a few other quotes from one or two other books, which I may read to you. Let's go back to the original statement and see if we can go deeper into it. Here it is again. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one seeing, one knowing, one love. Now, you can approach something like that in two ways. One is to hear it, listen to the words or read the words, and let the words penetrate you without attempting to analyze them. In other words, without trying to work out what it is they mean. And that's an interesting way and a very effective way of approaching a spiritual teaching. But it has to be an empowered statement that comes from the deepest source, as this does. Then it can work in that way. Receive it, be receptive to it non-analytically. So let's do this first. There is another way too, which we'll come to. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Can you just listen to that and allow it to sink in, and perhaps get a glimpse of the truth to which it points in yourself without any explanation or analysis? The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And the rest of the statement again. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. And now let's see if we approach it in a different way. Let's begin to think about it. Of course, then the first thing you will say is, well, the eye with which I see God, you say, well, my eye has actually never seen God. This eye has not seen God, nor could it ever see God, because God is not something that you can see. Okay, so that's the first stumbling block, but of course that means that what he's talking about here is not actually the physical eye. What he's talking about is deeper than the physical eye. That eye he's talking about, it's also deeper than seeing. He's not really talking about seeing, the visual act of perception. No. So what is it then? Well, could it be that he's talking about that in you that makes the seeing possible? That in you that makes the perception possible. And what's that? Consciousness. To give it a word. But that's only a word, of course. There is a light in which the perception appears, the visual perception, and that is not the external light. There is an inner light in which the perception is known, without which there could be no perception, there could be no seeing. And that inner light is the light of consciousness. And that is divine, and that is related to God in the same way that sunlight is related to the sun, ultimately one with the sun. The light emanates from the sun, the actual light that we can see, and in the same way, Meister Eckhart would say, or anybody who has gone deeply into him or herself, that is the light of the unconditioned, or the One, or God. So that in you that makes the seeing possible, that is the light of consciousness in you. That at this moment also makes the seeing possible and the hearing possible. Can you sense that in yourself, as yourself? That's where you transcend the person and go deeper, where you merge with the greater intelligence, where you see yourself, you suddenly realize that you are only a strand within that vast intelligence. You're an emanation of that. Now, from now on, every other quote, statement that I read will shed light on this, because this is the very core and essence. There is something in the soul that is so akin to God that it is one with Him. It has nothing in common with anything created. Okay, slight rephrasing. There is something in you that is so akin to God that it is one with Him. It has nothing in common with anything created. Anything created refers to the world of form, but physical forms or mental formations. There's something in you that is uncreated, timeless, eternal, an essence that has no form, and that is the source of your consciousness. The question is whether you can sense that in yourself at this moment. Not through knowing anything. There's no understanding or knowing in the conventional sense. Stillness, of course, is an inseparable part of knowing that essence in you, the uncreated. By the way, Eckhart uses the word nothing in common with anything created, in other words, uncreated, which is also a Buddhist term. Not that he had ever even heard of Buddhism. By the way, I've said several times before in various occasions, the best text if you want to understand Buddhism is to read Meister Eckhart, who had never heard of Buddhism. But there is no, although I love Buddhist teaching, it points to the essence in a clearer way than most other teachings. But Meister Eckhart is so powerful that there's nothing that surpasses that in any Buddhist text, and he goes to the very essence of the Buddha's teaching. Obviously, if the truth is one truth. Another little thing to help you, another statement by him. The outward man or woman, man means human being here, the outward man is the swinging door. The inner man is the still hinge. So if you can feel these two aspects to yourself, deep within you are the hinge, a point of absolute, unmovable stillness or presence. That's the inner being. The outer is the swinging door. And there's the question is whether you are connected with that, whether you can sense the hinge, we could call it the being, even as you move about mentally and physically, even as you are the swinging door. When you read Meister Eckhart, you will find that sometimes he uses two words. He uses God quite often, of course, because that is the terminology that he needed to use. But he also uses the word Godhead. So God and Godhead are not quite the same. They are and they aren't. That's an important distinction. And I'll just read to you a very brief passage where he explains the difference. And then, of course, it all comes back to something within you. It's always something to be known within you, not some abstract truth to be believed in. God becomes God when all creatures speak God forth. There God is born. When I was still in the ground, in the depths, in the flood and source of the Godhead, no one asked me where I wished to go or what I was doing. But as I flowed forth, all creatures uttered God. If someone were to ask me, Brother Eckhart, when did you leave your house? Then I was in there. This is how all creatures speak of God. And why do they not speak of the Godhead? All that is in the Godhead is one, and of this no one can speak. God acts, while the Godhead does not act. There is nothing for it to do, for there is no action in it. It has never sought to do anything. The difference between God and Godhead is that one acts and the other does not. If I return to God but do not remain there, then my breakthrough is far better than my flowing out. I alone free all creatures from their own ratio into my reason, my consciousness, so that may all be one in me. Now, he recognizes that this is difficult for people to understand. Therefore, he adds, whoever has understood this sermon, I wish them well. Had no one been here, I would still have had to preach it to this collecting box. In churches, they have the collecting box. He had to preach it. If no one had been there, he would have preached it in an empty church. God and the Godhead. Godhead, some of you may remember we talked a while ago about the Tao Te Ching, the ancient Chinese book of wisdom. Tao Te Ching. The Ching is the book. The Tao is that which cannot be named, the source of all life. The Te, Tao Te, Te is usually translated as virtue. That's a mistranslation. The true meaning of Te is power. So the Tao Te Ching is the book about the Tao, that which cannot be spoken of, and its power. Godhead and God. So Godhead is what Buddha calls the unmanifested, the unborn, the uncreated, or the emptiness, the very source out of which God, the Te, emanates. And so this God is the active principle. This God is the underlying, the intelligence that pervades and underlies and organizes and empowers the world of form that creates this body, this human being, this flower. So the intelligence underlying this universe is the Te, or God, in its various manifestations. At the source of it all is absolutely unknowable, but the Godhead or the Tao is your innermost essence. That is the still hinge in you. So it is the fulfillment of our destiny as a human being to connect with that, to know that consciously. It's a return to the source without disappearing in the source, but to know the source within you, the unmanifested, the unborn, the uncreated, and then be able to act in this world, being used by God, the emanation of the One. So returning to the source, that's what it is all about, and then living from the source. Now that which prevents us from realizing the source within is our illusory idea of who we are, the self. So, as all teachings tell us, that illusion needs to be recognized, that you are not ultimately a separate self, you have no separate existence. The illusory I needs to be recognized. And when that illusion has been transcended, you can live from a deeper place. You also become free of fear, because then you live from a place that cannot be killed or threatened, that which is not subject to decay or death. So our task is to recognize our own nothingness, no thingness, that we are ultimately not the form as which we appear, neither the physical form nor the psychological form. And so Meister Eckhart says, as long as I am this or that, or have this or that, I am not all things and I have not all things. Become pure till you neither are nor have either this or that. Then you are omnipresent, and being neither this nor that are all things. So he invites us to enter a particular state of consciousness that is ultimately formless. Formless consciousness itself. So in which concepts can be used, but in which you have transcended all mental forms. And that is not difficult. It basically means, although he never quite says it like that, I believe, is to transcend thought. And you can transcend thought at this very moment. And realize you're still fully here, even though you're not thinking or remembering who you are. So you let go of that, and you are simply the presence. And Meister Eckhart would say that is divine presence. And Meister Eckhart would say that is the birth of God into this world. Sometimes he calls it the birth of the sun. The birth of God into this world is when the formless dimension suddenly appears through you, the light of consciousness. And that's, Meister Eckhart said, is what the universe wants. It is striving towards that, the birth of God into this dimension. And so he says, nature's intent, by nature he means basically the universe, not just nature. Nature's intent is neither food, nor drink, nor clothing, nor comfort, nor anything else from which God is left out. Whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, secretly nature seeks and hunts and tries to ferret out the track in which God may be found. Something within this universe, that is the evolutionary impulse of the universe, it all points to that birth of the transcendent dimension into this world through you. He uses another analogy here, the next one. He often says that. He says God is a seed in us. In other words, it's a potential in every human being, but it's in most humans an unfulfilled potential, giving birth to that consciousness, the consciousness of the One, the unconditioned. The seed of God is in us. Given an intelligent and hard-working farmer, it will thrive and grow up to God, whose seed it is, and accordingly, its fruits will be God nature. Pear seeds grow into pear trees, nut seeds into nut trees, and God seed into God. Now let's see if we can shed some more light on this. Let's take a little break, and not a break as such. He recommends some practices, so to speak, not separate from everyday life and everyday living, to enable you to transcend the usual state of consciousness and go deeper. And here's one, it's very, very simple practice, and you may recognize it from another teaching. This sermon or talk of instruction is called How We Can Appropriately Enjoy Good Food, Fine Clothes, and Cheerful Company as these come our way in the natural course of things. This is perhaps one of his most approachable teachings, very simple. You should not worry yourself about food or clothing, feeling that these things are too good for you, but train your mind and the ground of your being to be above them. Nothing should rouse your mind to love and delight but God alone. It should be above all other things. It would be a sickly form of inwardness which needed to be put right by external clothing. Rather, as long as it is under your control, what is inside should correct what is outside. And if the latter, the outside, comes to you in a different form, then you should accept it as being good from the ground of your being, but in such a way that you would accept it just as willingly if it were different again. It is just the same with the food, the friends and the relatives, and with everything that God may give you or take from you. And so, in my view, the most important thing of all is that we should give ourselves up entirely to God whenever He allows anything to befall us, whether insult, tribulation, or any other kind of suffering, accepting it with joy and gratitude and allowing God to guide us all the more rather than seeking these things out ourselves. Willingly learn all things from God, therefore, and follow Him, and all will be well with you. Then we will be able to accept honor and comfort, and if dishonor and discomfort were to be our lot, we could and would be just as willing to endure these too. So they can justifiably feast who would just as willingly fast. You may recognize this teaching, which can be expressed in a different way as accept what is. Live in alignment with whatever form this moment takes. rather than demanding that this should be different. So he says here, people who see themselves as spiritual, they might say, oh, I mustn't be wearing these clothes, or I mustn't be in this company of these wealthy people, or have this good meal, I should be having that. Or when they're having a frugal meal, they say, oh, I wish I had something nice to eat. No, it says, whatever it is that appears, say yes to it. That's the teaching. And that is already a way of not emphasizing or de-emphasizing your form identity, your identification with form. Because whenever you say that this should not be or demand something else, in other words, you have an argument with the present moment, with what is, you're against what is, you're not one with what is, with life, then every time this happens, the false sense of self, the self, as Eckhart calls it, the self, gets strengthened. In other words, the illusion ultimately of who you are gets strengthened. So he teaches, he shows us the spiritual practice is to be fine with whatever arises, to be one with it. And that de-emphasizes your form, and it begins to awaken the formless in you. The ego or the self does not like this, as you know, from your own experience perhaps, hopefully from your own experience, as you also know from observing other people. The ego gets stronger when it can resist things and complain. As the Course in Miracles says, the ego gets strengthened in strife. It loves strife. And so you accept whatever arises. And here Meister Eckhart has this wonderful, become quite one of his famous statements. If the only prayer you said in your whole life was thank you, that would suffice. If you never said any other prayer but thank you, that would be enough. And so, he says, if a good meal comes, you say thank you. If you only have a few beans and a carrot, say thank you. If you have poor clothes, you still have clothes, say thank you. Nice clothes, thank you. You're not dependent on your nice clothes, or you're not dependent on a good meal. It's by accepting whatever arises, you also transcend what arises. And more you find what referred to a little earlier, the still center, the innermost core, the hinge. So that's pretty simple. And then practicing it every moment. Let's see what when he quotes scripture, let's see how he does that. He starts this sermon, almost every sermon starts with a quote from the Bible. So for today's quote is in Latin, of course, et cum factus esset Jesus annorum duodecim. We read in today's Gospel that when our Lord was 12 years old, he went with Mary and Joseph to Jerusalem to the temple. When they returned again, Jesus remained in the temple without their knowledge. When they arrived home and missed him, they sought him among their friends and relatives and among the crowd, but could not find him. They had lost him among all the people. Therefore they had to go back again to their starting point, and as they reached the temple, they found him. Those of you who have had a Christian upbringing, of course, know that story from the Gospels. And now, Meister Eckhart has just read from that, and now what he does is he performs what I could call an allegorical quantum leap and explains what this little passage really means. Of course it doesn't, but he has to do this to be acceptable within the cultural context. So it finishes then, as I just read, therefore they had to go back again to their starting point, and as they reached the temple, they found him, the boy Jesus, 12 years old. And now Meister Eckhart says, this too is what you must do, truly, if you wish to find the noble birth, leaving the crowd and returning to the source and ground from which you came. All the faculties and works of the soul constitute the crowd, memory, reason, and will, which all serve to divide and diversify you. Therefore you must leave them all. The activity of the senses and imagination and everything in which you are present to yourself or to your intentions. Only then can you find this birth, and not otherwise, believe me. It was never discovered among friends, relatives, or acquaintances. Rather, that is where it is lost. So you can see what he does with this passage. Immediately, he treats it as an allegory, and so the meaning becomes much deeper than the original meaning. Therefore, the following question arises: whether we can find this birth through particular things which, while divine, are mediated to us from outside by the senses. Certain concepts concerning God are an example of this, including the idea that God is good, that he is wise, merciful, or whatever it may be that reason can derive from itself and which is similarly divine. Can all this bring us the birth of God in the soul? Indeed not. For although it may all be good and of God, it is still all mediated by the senses from outside. But if this birth is to shine out in truth and purity, there must be a movement solely from within, from God. All your activity must be stilled, and all your powers must serve him and not yourself. If this work is to be perfect, then God alone must perform it, and you must passively receive it. Where you truly go out of your will and your knowledge, God truly and willingly enters in with his knowledge and shines there with great brilliance. Where God is to know himself in this way, then your knowing can neither coexist with it nor serve its ends. You should not imagine that your reason can evolve to the extent of understanding God. Rather, If God is to shine divinely within you, your natural light cannot assist this process, but must become a pure nothingness, going out of itself. Only then can God enter with His light, bringing back with Him all that you have renounced and 1,000 times more, including a new form which contains all things in itself. And now a wonderful statement here. If you wish to know God in a divine manner, then your knowing must become a pure unknowing, a forgetting of yourself and of all creatures. Your knowing must become an unknowing. That word reminds me of another wonderful teaching and book by an anonymous medieval writer who lived in England, who wrote a little book called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is how to, again, the similar thing, how to find God, the cloud of unknowing. So it is not through knowing that you find that inner essence. It's not through conceptual knowing. And so somebody asks now in this kind of dialogue that follows, now could you say, but sir, what is there left for my reason to do if it stands entirely bare and wholly inactive? In other words, what I'm supposed to think about. Is this the best way if I raise my mind to an unknowing knowing which cannot ever exist? For if I know something, then this is neither unknowing nor naked simplicity. Should I stand in complete darkness? Answer: yes, indeed. You are never better placed than when you are in complete darkness and unknowing. But, sir, must it all be removed? Can there be no return? No, truly, there can be no return. What is this darkness? What is it called? Its name means nothing other than a state of potential receptivity which in no way lacks being, but is a potential receptivity in which you shall be perfected. The more you are empty of self and are freed from the knowledge of objects, mental objects, the closer you come to Him. The true word of eternity is uttered only in solitude, where a man or woman is empty of self and multiplicity and is remote from them. And then another little question somebody seems to ask here. If we thus enter a state of pure nothingness, is it not better that we should do something in order to drive away the darkness and dereliction? Should we not pray or read or listen to a sermon or do something else that is virtuous in order to help ourselves? Answer: no, certainly not. The very best thing you can do is to remain still for as long as possible. And that simplifies it, doesn't it? The best thing you can do is to remain still for as long as possible. Doesn't mean still, of course, it's not saying don't move. It means still within. The cessation of mind activity without loss of consciousness, in fact, an intensification of consciousness, and that is the state of pure receptivity. And in that state, the inner transformation occurs. So the best thing you can do is to be still for as long as possible. And now one member in his audience, I suppose, probably a nun, asks, "You're always saying that this birth must take place in me, that the Son must be born in me, the birth of the Son in the human soul." That's, again, it's an allegorical interpretation of Scripture, the only begotten Son. Somebody then asks, "Well, now, can you please tell me how I might recognize that this birth has actually happened? How do I know that when it happens or that it has happened? The birth, or you could call it, we call it the awakening sometimes." "Certainly, there are 3 ways, and I shall now tell you one of them. I am often asked if it is possible for someone to advance so far that neither time, multiplicity, nor matter are obstacles to them anymore. Yes, indeed. When this birth has truly taken place in you, then no creatures can hinder you anymore. Rather, they all point you to God and to this birth. Take lightning as an analogy." He now uses this analogy, he himself calls it analogy, of lightning, and he says, I don't actually know whether that's true or not, probably is, or whether it's just medieval perception, doesn't really matter, but it probably is true, that lightning immediately turns whatever it strikes, whether tree, beast, or man, towards itself. If a tree had 1,000 leaves, they would all turn their right side towards the flash. So perhaps lightning has a magnetic attraction, that kind. So all the leaves, when it strikes a tree, turn towards it. But this is just an analogy. See, that is how it is for all those for whom this birth has already taken place. They are swiftly turned to this birth in whatever may be happening to them at the time, however coarse it may be. Now, important statement follows now. What was previously an obstacle to you is now a great help. Your face is fully turned to this birth. Anything that before would have been an obstacle now deepens your state. That may also sound a little bit familiar. You may have heard it before somewhere else. Indeed, in everything that you see or hear, whatever it may be, in all things you can receive nothing but this birth. All things become pure God to you, for in all things you see nothing but God. Just as when someone looks for a long time into the sun, whatever they look at subsequently, the image of the sun shall always appear. Whenever you do not see God and do not see Him in each and everything, then you do not have this birth. So no matter what happens to you, it can only strengthen this inner birth. It can only intensify the awakening. Things that before would have upset you, difficult people, challenging situations, now make you more present as you have surrendered the otherwise habitual resistance patterns that keep the ego going, that keep the ego strong. And as soon as anything happens, you're aligned with it. You don't oppose it internally, and that deepens your state. Now, you might think that he advocates a state of passivity or inaction because of the emphasis on stillness and so on, and surrender, but that's not the case. That would be a misperception. In fact, he said, the price of inaction is far greater than the cost of making a mistake. And now let's see how he reconciles activity with that inner state of surrender and stillness. Of course, that's vitally important. This talk is called On Inner and Outer Works. Supposing someone wanted to withdraw into themselves with all their faculties, both inner and outer, and they were in this state in such a way that there were neither any images nor impulses in them, and they were thus without any form of activity, either inner or outer, then they would have to note carefully whether there are not in them any spontaneous promptings to action. If nothing impels them to act, and they do not wish to undertake anything, then they should energetically force themselves to act, whether internally or externally, for we should rest content with nothing, however good it may seem to be, so that when we find ourselves under pressure or constraint, it will be apparent that we are more worked than working, and so that we may learn to enter into relationship of cooperation with our God. So you are not working, you are worked. God is working through you as you dwell in source awareness. Then that which emanates from the source, which is the Godhead, Tao, that which emanates is power and energy. And so, it is not that we should abandon, neglect, or deny our inner self, but we should learn to work precisely in it, with it, and from it in such a way that interiority turns into effective action, and effective action leads back to interiority, and we become used to acting without any compulsion. So it's not reactivity, it's not acting because you get these egoic urges, but the impulse comes from a much deeper place. So we become used to acting without any compulsion. For we should concentrate on this inner prompting and act from it, whether through reading or praying, or, if it is fitting, some form of external activity. Though if the external activity destroys the internal one, if you get stressed, if you get lost, as I call it, you get lost in the doing, if the external activity destroys the internal one, we should give priority to the latter. The inner is foundational, in other words. But if both are united as one, then that is best for cooperating with God. And our most important work, he says, is the eradication of self. But you can't You can't do it by yourself, he says. However great this eradication and reduction of self may be, it remains insufficient if God does not complete it in us. So this brings us to the question of humility and what that is. There is, of course, in the New Testament, Jesus talks about not seeking the highest place, but seek the lowest place. That's a universal spiritual teaching. And I've often spoken about this in various ways, and Meister Eckhart also talks about that. If you humble yourself, you are exalted. That is the teaching from the New Testament. But you are not exalted in such a way as if being brought low were one thing and being raised on high another. Rather, the highest point of the elevation lies in the deep ground of humility. For the deeper and lower the ground, the higher and more immeasurable is the elevation and the height. The deeper the well, the higher it is, for the height and the depth are one. That Jesus said, "He who desires to be the greatest, let him be the least among you. Whoever wishes to be the former must become the latter, for this being is found only in that becoming." Gospel also says, whoever humbles themselves will be lifted up. And now Meister Eckhart says, for our entire being is founded purely on a process of becoming nothingness. That is he's pointing to the evolution of the human being and the transition from being form identified to becoming essence identified. So your work is to become nothingness, which is not to emphasize the physical, or more importantly, the psychological form of I. And there are many ways of not emphasizing that, and of course one we already looked at just now, which is to be aligned with whatever happens in the present moment. And to be vigilant so that whenever the inner compulsion comes to be special, to stand out, to be right, to identify with your mental position and gaining strength in doing so, you are identified with form and you're trapped. And the birth cannot happen, as Meister Eckhart would say. Here, a wonderful little passage, and again, it's all about the same thing. It's all different, shedding light from somewhat slightly different angles on the same central core. I once said in a convent that the true image of the soul is found when nothing is informed or outformed but that which is God Himself. The soul has two eyes. Two eyes. An inner and an outer eye. The inner eye of the soul By the soul, by the way, you could say here, it's used in a very loose way. It's your consciousness. The soul has two eyes, an inner and an outer eye. The inner eye of the soul is the one which perceives being and receives its own being directly from God. This is the activity which is particular to itself. The outer eye of the soul is that which is directed towards all creatures and which perceives them in the manner of an image and the function of a faculty. But they who are turned within themselves so that they know God according to their own taste and in their own being are freed from all created things and are secure in themselves in a very fortress of truth. Just as I once said that on Easter Day our Lord came to his disciples through locked doors, so too God does not enter those who are freed from all otherness and all createdness. Rather, he already exists in an essential manner within them. God does not come to you. One could almost say God is freed from within you, comes through you. Now the two eyes, important. The two eyes are, of course, consciousness directed outward into sensory perception of all the physical forms, but outward, consciousness directed outward also means consciousness flowing into thought activity, because even thinking is outward. So the eye, the one eye of consciousness that looks outward, is that which is the consciousness becoming thought forms and mental formations and perceiving physical things, but they all become inner forms. When I perceive a flower, it becomes an inner image. So that's this eye that is directed outward. And many humans are lost. They only live in that outward looking and seeking state of consciousness. Meister Eckhart then points to the possibility of activating the inner eye of consciousness, so you can almost visualize it, you can visualize it as a spotlight. Here you have thought activity and sense perceptions, where most humans live, but you can also have an awareness of an underlying, whatever you want to call it, presence, stillness, spaciousness is there. That's the second eye that looks within. So you can look without and be aware of the two at the same time. And then that is the state of connectedness. And ultimately, that's what Meister Eckhart would call then the Godhead, the uncreated. It's pure awareness, pure beingness. That's always there. At this very moment, there's the external, and there's the consciousness behind it, which has no form. Let's call it, I often call it stillness. Can you sense the stillness at this very moment, although you are listening and seeing? So you are both, you're the listening and the seeing, but you are more fundamentally the stillness. So you're rooted in that. I haven't read any quote today from Meister Eckhart about time, but he often talks about the greatest obstacle to God realization, he says, is time. Of course, he talks about psychological time, and psychological time is inseparable from the activity of thought. So he taught from, undoubtedly, from this inner realization. Unlike most philosophers who just play with concepts. And we don't know how many of his listeners, especially the many women he taught, awakened spiritually. Probably quite a few. So even in the what we call the Dark Ages, when he lived, there were always the flame of consciousness, of spiritual awakening, somehow, miraculously, was still being kept alive in a few. Religion as a whole at that time was dominated by superstition and fear and a lot of madness, and yet there was also the others present. So you can read some more Meister Eckhart if you feel inclined, or maybe what we did today was enough. You've heard enough pointers. If you read him, then don't read too much at a time, just the same as, for example, especially a book like Stillness Speaks, read very little at any one time, so you're not there to absorb information, but to allow the reading to be transformational. It's a meditation. These things are not there to give you more knowledge, but really the opposite. They are not there to add on to you, but to remove. Not that it can do it for you. You still have to relinquish for yourself that which is recognized as illusion. The continuous pointing back by Eckhart to oneness, not only the concept of oneness, but also the realization of oneness, the one behind the many, that ultimately all the things that we see outside, the diversity is rooted in the one. And that is at the core of your being. A strange coincidence that I'm sure Eckhart didn't know about is that the first part of his name, Ek, is actually in the ancient language of India, the Sanskrit, actually means one. And I'm sure he never heard of Sanskrit. He didn't need to, because the truth is within the ultimate truth. But it's a little synchronistic event for a person who is teaching is focused on the one, to have this one as part of his name, and he didn't even know it. Probably, I assume, we don't know it, Meister Eckhart also sat in stillness before or after or during his sermons. I'm sure there were periods of stillness. He wouldn't just be talking about it. The stillness would be there, behind the words, between the words, and probably also moments of stillness, like now, a few words here, right now, but mainly stillness behind the words. Not just as the absence of sounds, but as a living presence within you. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our session and that it was more than listening to words, more than concepts, but tasting the reality behind the words, the concepts. Thank you.